Welcome to our study of Parshat Bo. Many years ago, the comedian David Brenner had a routine where he walked into a post office and there was a sign that said, "No animals allowed except for seeing eye dogs." And then he would say, "Who is supposed to read the poster?" So you realize that generally our conception of blindness is that there is this visual field that presents itself, but the person who is blind can't see it. So everyone who could read the poster didn't need to, and the person who needed to couldn't. I got that tidbit when reading from the writings of one of my favorite rabbis, Rabbi David Wolpe, who used to be at Temple Sinai in Los Angeles. You might know that he was recently at Harvard, but left when he understood that Harvard was not interested in doing what was right with regard to the treatment of Jewish students. Wolpe was recently forced to come to the realization that Harvard's DEI program, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program, was really a canard for anti-Semitism. And I'm actually quoting him at some level. He hadn't seen it that way when he joined Harvard. You see, he was a committed liberal who thought that being on the left meant that others on the left would always accept Jews as their equals and friends. That was all he could see until October 7th, when Wolpe finally perceived the light that had always been there. It came into his consciousness with the same shock and awe that many of our own clergy and community are feeling and reeling from today. But they, like Wolpe, had been blinded by their own version of social justice and consciousness, which was preventing them from seeing what was always there. Wolpe had, in his previous writings, pointed out that he thought that this reaction was exactly the reverse, or at least it may seem so, when it comes to the plague of darkness. There we assumed that the blindness came from Hashem having blotted out the visual field. The Egyptians can't see anything because it is dark, and by some miracle, the Israelites can see. They can see through the darkness by whatever magic of illumination that Hashem provides for the Israelites that he doesn't allow for the Egyptians. Now, however, maybe, just maybe, this blindness is analogous to some of our own people allowing their belief that their social justice allies were in fact actually allies, and thus turning us momentarily into blind Egyptians, seeing only what we were preconditioned to see. In the past, Rabbi Wolpe pointed out that there might be a different explanation, and that explanation may well have something to do with the sudden clarity of vision that many of us have recently experienced. Wolpe speaks of a Torah commentary by Rabbi Mark Angel, a modern Orthodox rabbi and author, and the Rabbi Emeritus of the Congregation Shalit Yisrael, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in New York City, one of the oldest. Rabbi Angel refers to a comment by a 19th century Sephardic rabbi named Yitzchak Samuel Reggio. He said that actually Hashem didn't spread darkness over the whole land. Hashem made it so that the Egyptians couldn't see. And this is a completely different way to look at it, whether true or not. The difference is that in this explanation, the problem isn't with the visual field. The problem is with the Egyptians' eyes. So while we know that the Torah is primarily a book about what people hear, Shema, listen, as Hashem reveals a word or a voice, the Torah is also a book about what people see and don't see. How does Moses become Moses? Moses is walking along and there's this bush that is burning, but it isn't consumed. It isn't turning into ashes. And Moses said, I have to turn aside and look at this because this is remarkable. And then the Torah says, when Hashem saw that Moses turned aside to look, then Hashem called out to him saying, Moshe, Moshe, Moses, Moses. So the rabbis noted that the bush had been on fire for a long time, but only Moses noticed. Only Moses looked. And that is why Hashem chose him, because Moses wasn't blind to the wonders of the world. Rabbi Volpe talks of a friend, another rabbi friend of his, who had mentioned that he had once spent a long time staring at a log burning in a fireplace, and noted how long and hard you must actually stare to perceive whether something that is burning is turning to ash. He said that Moses couldn't just have glanced at that bush. He had to really, really look. And yet in our lives, it isn't just that we don't look, but that we are flooded by visual data. Our visual field has so much to see that we find it hard to pay attention to anything in particular or to any individual person or phenomenon. But even when we do look, we are blinded by our own preconditioned ideals and our own intransigence when it comes to allowing conflicting ideas any space in our consciousness. There is a concept in psychology called the illusion of validity. The illusion of validity is whenever you hear a statistic that reinforces your own personal point of view, it sinks in. But when you hear a statistic that contradicts your view, you dismiss it out of hand. We see this in action in politics all the time. Whether you are a liberal or a conservative, it's not as though the other side doesn't actually have some statistics or facts that support their position. They usually do. But it is that you are resolutely on one side or the other, and the statistics or facts that support the other side are not something to be learned from. They are something to be refuted because it's a battle. It's not a search for the truth. And that's the illusion of validity. Whatever they say, they're wrong. And when you hear something that reinforces your own point of view, it just makes your conviction deeper or more certain. Just like the Egyptians, if they weren't so certain of their own position, they wouldn't have lived through all those plagues without letting the Israelites go. Someone would have said, the fact is that this doesn't seem to be working. But progressively, with each plague, there was an explanation, as there always is when we get contrary evidence, as to why this plague is an anomaly, or that plague will go away, or it isn't about the Jews, or their Hebrew God will get tired and give up, and our Egyptian gods will eventually combat this. Or in today's world, the other people in the woke movement really love us because, of course, they see us as allies and not as Jews. And as Rabbi Wolpe points out, if you think that just explaining away the plagues is far-fetched, then all you have to do is read about the history of slavery in this country. You will see elaborate, well-reasoned, repeated arguments from intelligent and otherwise compassionate people about why slavery is a good thing. And remember, it wasn't an argument that ended it. It was a war. And in miniature, we do the same thing in our own lives. We don't like to be challenged, and we don't like to be changed. But there is, at least in this plague, one way out. Because after the plague of darkness hits, the Torah says that the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt in the eyes of Pharaoh's people. In the eyes of Pharaoh's people. So all of a sudden, for people who couldn't see, once their eyes were opened after the darkness, in their eyes, our Moses was great, which should teach us something about the value of darkness and confusion. And that's really what this plague may have come to teach us. It may be teaching us that darkness and confusion and perplexity are good and to be valued. Because in our lives, if we have difficulty and we have darkness and we have confusion, there is a very powerful impulse to get out of it and find a solution. But sometimes maybe the darkness upends our assumptions, changes the way we look at things, makes things different, and in the end, as with the Egyptians, can sometimes make things clearer. In other words, unlike the other plagues, the ninth plague, the plague of darkness, was actually a favor. Hashem was doing one last service for the Egyptians to try and make things clear before Mekat Bechorot, before the killing of the firstborn, before the terrible, murderous end to slavery in Egypt. Hashem said, if none of the signs I've sent so far will convince them, then maybe, just maybe, if I plunge them into darkness, and if they understand that they can't see, if they realize that all their assumptions are mistaken, then maybe it will cause a reevaluation of their lives and their priorities. It didn't work, but it was a good try. And maybe, just maybe, it may work for us. When the Israelites come out of Egypt and they go to Mount Sinai and Hashem reveals the Torah, it says, Vayorim et hakolot. The Israelites saw. They saw the voices. Now, we all know you can't see voices. But what the rabbis say is that the effect of the voices on the Israelites' lives, the effect of the voices they heard, those effects were visible. You could see them because by now the Israelites had been trained how to see. The idea of darkness, the idea of questioning, of wonder, of perplexity, of uncertainty, these are things we instinctively shrink from. We don't want to be uncertain. We want to know. We are meaning-making machines. We think we need to know what path to follow. And yet it is in the unknowing that sometimes we find ourselves on the path to truth. So let's take a cue from the plague of darkness and wish for a little bit of that plague in our own lives. The darkness that allows us to understand that there are things that we just don't understand. A darkness that allows us to be uncertain of our certainties. A darkness that reminds us that the only perfect knowledge is Hashem's knowledge. And although we walk in darkness, that's good. Because only when we are in darkness do we search for light. Shabbat Shalom.